For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Madam Speaker, I ask to address the House for 1 minute for the purpose of inquiring about next week's schedule.
The gentleman is, without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I yield to the gentleman from Maryland, the Majority Leader, for the purpose of announcing next week's schedule.
I thank my friend for yielding. On Monday, Madam Speaker, the House will meet at 12:30 p.m. for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business, with votes postponed until 6:30 p.m. On Tuesday, the Former Members Association will have their annual meeting on the floor at 8:30 a.m., and the House will then meet at 10:30 a.m. for morning hour debate and 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Wednesday and Thursday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for legislative business, and on Friday, as is usual, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. Madam Speaker, we will consider several bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be noted by the end of the day. In addition, we'll consider a conference report on H.R. 2346, the Supplemental Appropriation Act, the 2010 Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies Appropriation Act, and the 2010 Homeland Security Appropriations Act. And I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I thank the gentleman. I'd say to the gentleman that he's noticed 2 appropriations bills for next week, Commerce, Justice, Science, and Homeland Security appropriations bills. And, Madam Speaker, I'd ask the gentleman, does he expect the House, as is its custom, to consider these bills under an open rule? And I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. It certainly will be our intent to proceed with an open rule on the consideration of the Commerce, Justice, State bill, or I guess it's Science now, bill. The intent, of course, as the gentleman knows, based upon our discussions, is that we will finish all 12 appropriation bills individually between now and the 30th of July. This will give the Senate and the House the opportunity to agree on a conference report on the 12 appropriation bills and hopefully enact those bills and send them to the President prior to the onset of the fiscal year, October 1. If we do that, of course, it will be unusual, and it's a ambitious schedule. But because of that, it will be necessary for us to consider these bills in an effective but also efficient fashion and stay within time constraints that will allow us to accomplish those 12 bills within that time frame. I'm hopeful that as Mr. Obey and Mr. Lewis proceed and the subcommittee chairs proceed, that we can agree on that occurring. As the gentleman and I have discussed, we will see how the first bill goes, or the second or third, and hopefully they will go in that fashion. The only constraint that we want is to utilize the time so we can effect the objective of passing these bills by the August break, so we will have time to finish them before the beginning of the fiscal year. I would tell my friend, in addition to that, there will be one, however, additional request that the chairman of the Appropriations Committee has made, with which I strongly agree, and that I think is fair to all the members and to the committee chairs and subcommittee chairs, and that is there will be a requirement for pre-printing an amendment. There will be no selection of, in this CJS bill, of amendments, but there will be a requirement that they be pre-printed and included in the record. If, however, I want to assure the gentleman there is some problem with the record reflecting an amendment that has been pre-filed but doesn't make it in the record, we would proceed as if that had been included in the printed record.
Madam Speaker, I thank the gentleman. As the gentleman knows, in 2005, this House did abide by a schedule such as the one that he proposes, and did so under an open rule on each bill. I'd ask the gentleman if, given this pre-printing requirement that we are proceeding under, if there is a need for a perfecting amendment that comes upon the adoption of an amendment, how is it that we will be necessarily guaranteeing that members perfecting amendment the right to be heard? Will there be a UC granted for such a perfecting amendment? I yield.
I thank my friend for yielding. I've discussed this matter with the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and it is his view, and I share this view, that certainly in that instance a unanimous consent granting by unanimous consent would be appropriate. Obviously, if the circumstances change and such an amendment were necessary, I think the gentleman will find that the chairman is inclined, and I believe the subcommittee chairman will be inclined to give unanimous consent to achieve that objective.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Speaker, I'd say to the gentleman that the Speaker of the House has announced a goal of considering the cap-and-trade bill on the floor prior to July 4th recess. And I would ask the Majority Leader, does he expect the Speaker's goal to be met? And I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. We certainly hope so. The Speaker and I have both indicated with respect to the energy bill, which seeks to not only address the conservation of our energy and make us energy independent, but also seeks to address the global warming challenge that confronts our globe, to pass that legislation in a timely fashion. It passed out of committee, as the gentleman knows, the week before, or the week when we left for the Memorial Day break. So it's been pending now for at least 3 weeks. It is our hope that we can move forward on this as early, perhaps, as the last week in June, which would be immediately before the July 4th break. Time will, and circumstances will dictate whether or not that is possible. But we certainly do hope to consider that in the near term. In addition, as the gentleman probably knows, undoubtedly knows, we are also have under consideration the health care bill, which the President has made a very high priority, and which we've made a very high priority. So that bill will also, we hope, be considered prior to the August break. So those two bills are major pieces of legislation that we hope to consider. But I don't want to give an exact date on those because they're complicated pieces of legislation, and we hope that we can reach agreement. We'd like to reach agreement across the aisle as well on, if not all facets, at least some facets of that bill. We know that I'm sure your side has considerations that will help us perfect a bill. I think we'll probably have some disagreements, but nevertheless we hope to move forward together on this bill, on both bills.
Madam Speaker, I thank the gentleman, and I'd like to ask a follow-up of the Majority Leader, specifically for the benefit of the members who serve on the Ways and Means and the Agricultural Committee. Will we anticipate that they will have, those two committees will have an opportunity to hear and mark up the bill, the cap-and-trade bill, and I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I've discussed this matter with the chairman of the committee, of both committees. Certainly they will have the opportunity. Whether they will avail themselves of that opportunity, I can't say at this point in time. And what I mean by that is that there are clearly concerns that both committees have and have been expressed, but whether or not they're going to actually go to a markup of the bill or try to perfect it in other ways, either on the floor or in working with the Energy and Commerce Committee, I don't think has been decided by either committee at this point in time.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Speaker, I'd now like to point out to the gentleman, I believe, as all of us know, that our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan have spent the last 29 days waiting for this Congress to authorize the funding that they need to execute their mission to maintain not only their own safety, but the safety of us here at home. We have heard reports since last night that the war funding bill and its provision and primary mission of funding the troops has now been somewhat eclipsed by provisions which have no relation to protecting and supporting our troops in the field. So I'd ask the gentleman, could he confirm, number one, that $108 billion scored at the $5 billion by the Congressional Budget Office, whether that will be included, that money for the IMF, will it be included in the troop funding bill? Number two, are the reports correct which have indicated that the provisions prohibiting the release of detainee photos has now been stripped from the measure that we will consider? And thirdly, could the gentleman confirm that the conference report coming to the House will now allow for the transfer of the Guantanamo detainees into the United States. And I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. As the gentleman recalls, we had a relatively robust discussion about this last week. Let me first of all say that the principal purpose of this bill was, is, and will be on Tuesday the funding of our troops in the field, providing them with the resources necessary to complete successfully or pursue successfully the tasks that we've given them, and to provide for their safety and well-being to the possible extent we can. So that was the intent, it is the intent, and will remain the intent. Now, let me make a suggestion that providing for some of the poorest nations in the world to be more successful economically will not only be beneficial to our country and to the international economy generally, but also to the safety of our troops, very frankly. It is obviously in deep poverty and frustration from which many of the terrorists that we have seen have been recruited. To the extent we provide for the economies of these small, troubled countries, we may well be a safer world, not only economically better off, but from a security standpoint better off. So we perceive the IMF as an integral part of a process seeking security. I might say that the IMF, as I quoted last week, very strongly supported by Ronald Reagan, very strongly supported by both President Bushes, but particularly President Bush the first, where they said investing in the IMF was an investment in the well-being of the international community and our own country. As you indicate, that 108 billion scores at 5 billion because it's a loan guarantee, it's not a giveaway. So that we believe the IMF is a very important part of it. And to answer your question, the IMF will, in fact, be a part, as I think the gentleman probably knows, of the conference report that has been that will be filed perhaps later tonight. With respect to your second question regarding, well, I guess your third question, because the first was about the security of the troops. Third question, Guantanamo. Let me first of all read a letter, a paragraph of a letter dated June 11th to Mr. Obey and Mr. Inouye, the Senate Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, from President Obama. He says, on May 13th, I announced I would resist the release of additional detainee photos because I did not believe it would add any additional benefit to our understanding of what happened in the past, and that the most direct consequences of releasing them would be to further inflame anti-American opinion and put our troops in greater danger. Earlier today, the Second Circuit granted the government's motion that will stay the earlier court order to release the detainees' photos, and we will now move forward with a petition to the Supreme Court to appeal the case. He goes on to say, I deeply appreciate all you have done to help with the effort to secure funding for the troops, and assure you that I will continue to take every legal and administrative remedy available to me to ensure that the DOD detainee photographs are not released. Should a legislative solution prove necessary, I am committed to working with the Congress to enact legislation that achieves the objectives we share. With respect, lastly, Mr. Whip, to the detainees. As you know, one detainee was in fact transferred to the United States, to New York, for the purposes of trial. That is not unusual, as the gentleman knows. Many terrorists have been tried in the New York District Court, in which this trial will occur. In addition to that, 4 Uyghurs who had been ordered released by the court because they had the court concluded there was no proof of terrorist activity by the Uyghurs. They've been released to Bermuda. One Iraqi detainee, Mr. Sadkhan, was returned to Iraq. One Chadian detainee was returned to Chad. And Mr. Gilani, to whom I referred to earlier, has been transferred to New York City, where there is a standing indictment against him. He'll be tried for his role in the 1998 embassy attacks in Tanzania, Kenya, in which the father and brother of one of my constituents, Edith Bartley, were killed, Julian and Jay Bartley. So I, for one, am pleased that this gentleman I use that term loosely, unfortunately, but this individual will be tried and brought to justice. All four of his co-conspirators have been found guilty and are serving out sentence in the U.S. Supermax prison. It has been agreed that detainees will be brought here under the language, as I understand it, that has been adopted, that detainees would be brought to the United States for no other purpose than prosecution.
I thank the gentleman. And, Madam Speaker, I would respond by going back to the gentleman's original statement concerning the principal purpose of the war funding bill. And that, he said, if I can paraphrase, the intent of the bill is to fund our troops. So I am at somewhat of a loss to understand why we have taken 29 days. We've already had one strong bipartisan vote in this House with nearly unanimity on our side of the aisle to provide the necessary funding for our troops. So I'm at somewhat of a loss to understand why the delay. The gentleman speaks of the urgent need for us as U.S. taxpayers to fund a global bailout. And the gentleman said that there is indication that somehow if we address the issue of poverty, that we will then be lessening the number of terrorists. I don't know, Madam Speaker, if all of us would agree with that or not. No question, reducing poverty is a laudable goal. But we are also in the business here in Washington of setting priorities. Priority one should be the funding of our troops and to secure this country and its citizens. And thank God we have our men and women in uniform there. They should be our priority in executing in terms of advocating for the safety and fighting for the security of this country. So I am still, to use a gentleman's word from last week, confounded as to why it is we cannot have the IMF funding go through regular order in this House. As you know, reports have indicated that actions have been taken by this administration, especially Secretary Geithner, to cast a vote in favor of increasing access to money and credit for the member nations of the IMF. That is done without congressional approval. And we're talking here specifically about the special drawing rights of nations at the IMF. We've also found out that the nation of Iran will have the ability to access funding of over $1 billion through this process. To me, that calls for congressional oversight and action. It doesn't warrant delaying this bill. It doesn't warrant putting on the backs of our troops the funding of nations, frankly, that are providing support for the destruction of our efforts and endangering our troops on the ground in Iraq and in the region. So I have a question to the gentleman of why it is so important that we go ahead and fund a global bailout when the primary mission is to fund our troops, and I yield back.